Dearest listeners, before we embark upon today's most extraordinary tale of sacrifice and redemption, might I suggest, if you find yourself as captivated by these chronicles of the heart as this author hopes, that you express your appreciation through the modern conveniences at your disposal. A subscription ensures you never miss a scandalous revelation, whilst your comments provide delightful discourse on matters of the heart. And should the mysterious hype be within your power to bestow, this humble chronicler would be most grateful for such enthusiasm. But let us not tarry further. Society teaches us that marriage is a transaction, yet the heart, that most rebellious of organs, refuses to be bartered like common goods at market. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most haunting tale of a lady who sold herself to save her family, only to discover that her purchaser harbored wounds deeper than any purse could heal. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest port, must be savored properly. The morning sun cast long shadows across the worn Turkish carpet of Fairmont House, as Lady Elizabeth Fairmont studied the ledger before her with the intensity of a general surveying a battlefield. At 23, she possessed the sort of beauty that poets might describe as ethereal. Golden hair that caught light like spun silk, eyes more gray than blue that held the calm of a winter sky. Beautiful, certainly, but promising no warmth to strangers. There was a precision in her delicate features that mirrored the way she managed their dwindling accounts. No room for frivolity, every line deliberate and necessary. Yet it was the steel in her spine and the determination in her bearing that truly defined her character. The numbers before her told a story of catastrophe. Her father, the late Viscount Fairmont, had departed this mortal coil 6 months prior, leaving behind not the comfortable legacy his family had expected, but rather a mountain of gaming debts and mortgages that threatened to consume everything. The estate in Hampshire was already lost, sold to satisfy the most pressing creditors. Fairmont House in Grosvenor Square remained only through the grudging patience of their father's solicitor, who had granted them until Michaelmas to arrange their affairs. Elizabeth's 3 younger sisters, Jane at 19, Margaret at 17, and little Rose at barely 15, depended upon her entirely. Their mother had perished bringing Rose into the world, leaving Elizabeth to assume the mantle of both sister and maternal guardian. Without dowries, without connections, without even the modest income that might sustain them in genteel poverty, their prospects were bleaker than a November sky over the Thames. The drawing-room door opened with its familiar creak, another repair they could ill afford, and Jane entered, her usually cheerful countenance clouded with worry. Where Elizabeth was fair, Jane was dark, possessing their father's mahogany locks and warm brown eyes. She moved with the natural grace that had once made her the toast of their country assemblies, before their world had crumbled like ancient parchment. Elizabeth observed her sister's approach, noting the careful mending on her morning dress, Jane's own handiwork, for they had been forced to dismiss all but 2 servants. Jane had always possessed a gift for bringing harmony to their household, her greatest pleasure found in caring for others and creating beauty from the simplest things. Talents that once had her composing little melodies at the pianoforte and translating Italian sonnets for their mother's amusement, pursuits she now had little time to cultivate. Their circumstances had already begun to tell in 1,000 small economies. The fires lit only in occupied rooms, the meals grown simple and sparse, the gradual disappearance of luxuries they had once taken for granted. Margaret appeared moments later, her auburn hair catching the light as she crossed to the window. At 17, she possessed a lively intelligence that might have been nurtured at one of the better seminaries, had funds permitted. Instead, she had educated herself through their father's library, devouring volumes on history, philosophy, and languages, with an appetite that would have marked her as a blue stocking in more prosperous circumstances. Young Rose, still permitted the privilege of the schoolroom by virtue of her tender years, remained above with their elderly governess, Mrs. Fielding, the only member of their reduced household who served without wages, sustained by loyalty alone and the promise of a reference when the inevitable dissolution came. The Morning Post had brought a letter that Elizabeth had read 3 times, each perusal rendering its contents no less shocking. Lord Pemberton, their father's closest friend, and one of the few who had not entirely cut their acquaintance, had written with what he termed a solution to their difficulties. His nephew by marriage, Marcus Ashworth, the Earl of Blackmore, required a wife. The Earl, Pemberton delicately suggested, was prepared to be extraordinarily generous in the matter of settlements, generous enough to provide dowries for all 3 younger Fairmont sisters and a modest competence for their maintenance. The Earl of Blackmore. Even thinking the name sent an involuntary shiver through Elizabeth's frame. She knew of him, of course. All of society did, though he had not graced a London drawing room in 5 years. The stories that circulated about him were the stuff of Gothic novels. A duel at dawn that had left the younger son of the Duke of Worthington dead, the subsequent broken engagement to Lady Catherine Worthington, and his self-imposed exile to his estates in Yorkshire. Some whispered he was mad, others that he was marked by the devil himself. All agreed he was dangerous. Yet what choice had she? Elizabeth's fingers traced the columns of figures once more, as if hoping they might somehow rearrange themselves into a more favorable configuration. The alternatives were too terrible to contemplate. Jane, with her sweet nature and trusting heart, forced into service as a governess or companion. Margaret, with her brilliant mind, withering away as a poor relation in some distant cousin's household. And Rose, dear innocent Rose, cast into a world that devoured young girls without protection or fortune. Lord Pemberton had arranged for the Earl to call that very afternoon. Elizabeth had not informed her sisters of the appointment, preferring to shoulder this particular burden alone. She would meet this mysterious Earl, this man of dark reputation and darker rumors, and she would do what must be done. If selling herself into marriage with a monster would save her sisters, then so be it. She had made greater sacrifices for far less cause. The clock on the mantelpiece, one of the few valuable pieces they had not yet been forced to sell, chimed the hour. 11 o'clock. In 4 hours, the Earl of Blackmore would arrive, and Elizabeth would begin negotiations for the sale of the only commodity she had left, herself. She rose from the escritoire, squaring her shoulders as she had seen her father do before entering particularly contentious sessions of Parliament. The morning dress she wore, a simple muslin in dove gray that had been turned twice and refreshed with new ribbon, would have to suffice. They had long since exhausted the funds for anything approaching fashionable attire. Elizabeth moved to the window, gazing out at the square below, where fashionable carriages rolled past, their occupants blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding within Fairmont House. How many times had she stood at this very window, watching the world go by, dreaming of her own debut, her own triumph in the marriage mart. Those dreams belonged to a different girl, one who had believed in fairy tales and happy endings. The Elizabeth who stood here now understood that life was not a romance novel. It was a ledger that must be balanced, whatever the cost. The Earl of Blackmore arrived precisely at 3 o'clock, neither fashionably late nor vulgarly early. Elizabeth, watching from behind the drawing-room curtains, observed his descent from a traveling coach that, while well appointed, bore none of the ostentatious gilding favored by many of his rank. He moved with a controlled grace that spoke of military training. Indeed, she recalled hearing that he had served with distinction in the peninsula before inheriting his title. He was not at all what she had expected. Where her imagination had conjured a dissolute rake bearing the visible marks of his supposed villainy, the man who stood at their door was altogether different. Tall and broad-shouldered, Marcus Ashworth possessed the kind of austere handsomeness that belonged more to classical statuary than London drawing rooms. His hair, black as a raven's wing, was cut shorter than fashion dictated, and his face bore lines that spoke of suffering rather than dissipation. But it was his eyes that struck her most forcefully, gray as winter storms, holding depths of something she could not quite name. Pain, perhaps, or a weariness that went beyond the physical. Elizabeth had positioned herself in the drawing room with careful deliberation, choosing a seat that would allow the afternoon light to fall favorably upon her, while maintaining the proper distance from where her guest would be invited to sit. She had sent Jane and Margaret on an errand to Bond Street, an extravagance they could ill afford, but necessary to ensure privacy for this most delicate of negotiations. Their butler, old Simmons, announced the Earl with as much dignity as his 70 years and threadbare livery would allow. Lord Blackmore entered the room, and Elizabeth was struck anew by his presence, not menacing, as she had anticipated, but somehow compelling in its very restraint. He bowed with perfect correctness, neither too deep nor too shallow, and waited for her invitation before taking his seat. For a moment, they regarded each other in silence. Elizabeth had prepared a number of conversational gambits, but found them all dying on her lips. There was something in his steady gaze that seemed to see through social pleasantries to the very heart of matters. When he spoke, his voice was deeper than she had expected, with a slight roughness that suggested disuse rather than affectation. He dispensed with the usual observations about weather and mutual acquaintances, cutting directly to the purpose of his visit. Lord Pemberton, he explained, had made him aware of the Fairmont family's circumstances. He required a wife to manage his households and eventually to provide an heir. He was prepared to offer generous terms, £20,000 to be settled upon her sisters immediately, with additional provisions for their education and establishment. For Elizabeth herself, a jointure of £3,000 per annum should she survive him, and complete autonomy in the management of household affairs. The terms were more than generous, they were munificent. Elizabeth knew she should feel relief, perhaps even gratitude. Instead, she felt a curious emptiness, as if she were observing the scene from a great distance. She heard herself asking practical questions about expectations and arrangements, her voice steady despite the tumult in her breast. Lord Blackmore answered each query with the same measured calm. He spent most of his time at Thornfield Abbey, his principal seat in Yorkshire. He did not require her to entertain or to participate in society. Indeed, he preferred isolation. He would not interfere with her decisions regarding her sisters, who would be welcome to visit or reside at the Abbey as she wished. The marriage would be one of convenience, he stated with clinical detachment, though he would expect her to fulfill all the duties of a wife. At this last, a slight color rose to Elizabeth's cheeks, but she maintained her composure. She understood what was being asked of her, what was being purchased. She was not so naive as to imagine otherwise. As their interview progressed, Elizabeth found herself studying him with increasing fascination. There was something about the way he held himself, perfectly correct, yet somehow apart, as if invisible walls separated him from the rest of humanity. When she offered tea, she noticed how his hand trembled slightly before he controlled it, declining her hospitality with polite firmness. When a coachman's whip cracked like a pistol shot in the street outside, he startled almost imperceptibly, his hand moving to his side where a sword might once have hung. These observations led her to a sudden understanding. The Earl of Blackmore was not a monster. He was a man in profound pain, carrying wounds that had never properly healed. The realization did not make her situation any less dire, but it shifted something fundamental in her perception. As he prepared to take his leave, having secured her agreement to consider his proposal, an unexpected incident occurred. Rose, having escaped her governess, burst into the drawing room in a flutter of ribbons and excitement, only to stop short at the sight of the strange gentleman. At 15, Rose retained the innocent exuberance that life had not yet managed to extinguish. Her eyes, the same storm gray as Elizabeth's, widened with curiosity rather than fear. Lord Blackmore rose immediately, and Elizabeth watched in amazement as, for the first time, the chronic pain in his eyes gave way to genuine curiosity, the tension he perpetually carried in his jaw dissolving for one remarkable instant. He bowed to Rose with the same courtesy he might have shown a duchess, and when Rose, in her artless way, began chattering about the robin's nest she had discovered in the garden, he listened with what appeared to be genuine interest. The interaction lasted mere moments before Mrs. Fielding appeared, flustered and apologetic, to retrieve her charge. But in those brief seconds, Elizabeth glimpsed something unexpected in the Earl's eyes, a flash of warmth, quickly suppressed, that suggested the man he might once have been. After his departure, Elizabeth stood at the window, watching his carriage disappear into the London traffic. Her decision was made, had been made from the moment she read Lord Pemberton's letter, but now it was sealed by something more than desperation. She had seen beneath the Earl's forbidding exterior, if only for an instant, and recognized a kindred spirit, someone else who had learned to lock away their true self behind walls of necessity. That evening, she penned her acceptance, her hand steady as she signed away her freedom. But as she sealed the letter, she found herself wondering if perhaps, just perhaps, she might be gaining something more than she was losing. The banns were read with unseemly haste, society's tongues wagging at the speed of this unlikely alliance. Within 3 weeks of their initial meeting, Elizabeth found herself standing in the drawing room of Blackmore House in Mayfair, now her London residence, though she understood they would rarely occupy it. The ceremony itself had been a sparse affair at St. George's, attended only by Lord Pemberton, her sisters, and a handful of Lord Blackmore's solicitors. The groom had been correct but distant, his responses during the service delivered in that same measured tone she had come to associate with him. The wedding breakfast, such as it was, passed in a blur of stilted conversation and worried glances from her sisters. Jane had wept openly when Elizabeth had informed them of her decision, while Margaret had gone very quiet, her sharp mind undoubtedly calculating exactly what sacrifice was being made. Only Rose had seemed genuinely pleased, perhaps seeing in this match the stuff of fairy tales rather than the business transaction it truly was. Now, as late afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows of her new home, Elizabeth found herself alone with her husband for the first time since exchanging their vows. Lord Blackmore, she could not yet think of him as Marcus, stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid as a sentry's. The silence stretched between them, fraught with unspoken expectations and uncertainties. He had made it clear that they would depart for Yorkshire on the morrow, leaving London and its gossips behind. Elizabeth had already overseen the packing of her few belongings, supplemented by a new wardrobe he had insisted upon providing. Simple, elegant gowns suitable for a countess, though lacking the ostentation many would have expected. The modiste had been surprised by the selections, muttering about country fashions and lost opportunities to showcase her skills. As Elizabeth observed her new husband in the fading light, she noticed details that had escaped her before. A thin scar ran along his left jaw, barely visible unless one knew to look. His hands, she realized, bore the calluses of someone who worked with them, unusual for a peer of his standing. When he moved to pour himself a brandy, she caught the slight favoring of his right leg, so subtle that most would miss it entirely. The evening that followed established what would become their pattern in the days to come. They dined together in relative silence, the clink of silver against china unnaturally loud in the hushed atmosphere. He inquired after her comfort, ensured she had everything she required, then retreated to his study. Elizabeth found herself alone in the Countess's chambers, surrounded by luxury that felt as foreign as the gold band weighing heavy on her finger. The journey to Yorkshire took 3 days, the autumn countryside rolling past their carriage windows in a succession of gold and russet hues. Lord Blackmore rode alongside for much of the journey rather than within, claiming a preference for fresh air. Elizabeth suspected he found the confined space oppressive, though she could not say why she sensed this. Thornfield Abbey, when it finally came into view, took her breath away. Not for its grandeur, though it was indeed grand, but for its wild, untamed beauty. The house itself was ancient, its grey stone walls rising from the Yorkshire moors like something grown from the earth itself rather than built upon it. The air here was different, crisp and carrying the scent of wet earth and wild heather, a perfume far older than anything London could offer. The only sound was that of the wind rushing across the moors, a constant murmur that spoke of solitude and eternity. Ivy climbed the eastern wall in magnificent abandon, and the gardens, while clearly once formal, had been allowed to embrace a more natural state. Mrs. Harrington, the housekeeper, greeted them with warm efficiency. A woman of middle years, with steel-gray hair and kind eyes, she showed Elizabeth through the house with evident pride. The staff, Elizabeth quickly realized, regarded their master with a mixture of respect and concern, the loyalty of people who had seen him at his worst and remained nonetheless. The first weeks of their marriage passed in careful choreography. Lord Blackmore maintained his distance with scrupulous courtesy, appearing for meals and occasionally joining her in the evening, though he spent most of his time either in his study or out on the moors. Elizabeth threw herself into learning the management of the household, finding unexpected satisfaction in bringing order to areas that had been neglected. It was during one of her explorations that she discovered the portrait gallery. Row upon row of Ashworth ancestors gazed down at her, their painted eyes holding centuries of stories. She paused before a more recent addition, a family grouping that must have been commissioned perhaps 10 years ago. A younger Marcus stood beside his parents, his face unlined and open in a way she had never seen. But it was the figure beside him that held her attention. Another young man, bearing enough resemblance to be a brother, though she knew Marcus was an only child. Mrs. Harrington, finding her there, provided the explanation unbidden. The young man was James Worthington, Lord Blackmore's closest friend since their Eton days. The same James Worthington who had died by Marcus's hand in that infamous duel. The housekeeper's voice held no judgment as she related what she knew, that there had been some terrible misunderstanding, that Lord Blackmore had never spoken of what had transpired, and that he had punished himself far more severely than society ever could. As the weeks progressed, Elizabeth began to piece together more of her husband's story through observation and carefully gleaned information. The servants spoke of nightmares that woke the house, of long rides across the moors in weather that would daunt a seasoned soldier, of the way he avoided any gathering larger than their dinner table. She learned that he supported numerous charitable works anonymously, that he ensured every tenant on his estates was treated fairly, and that he had once been known for his laughter, a sound none had heard in 5 years. One evening, a month into their marriage, an unexpected incident cracked the careful facade they had both maintained. Elizabeth had been in the music room, playing the pianoforte, one of the few accomplishments her education had afforded her. Lost in a particularly challenging passage of Mozart, she had not heard Marcus enter. When she finished and turned, she found him standing in the doorway, his face bearing an expression of such raw longing that it stopped her heart. He apologized immediately, that wall of courtesy slamming back into place, but Elizabeth had seen beneath it once again. She invited him to stay, to listen if he wished, and though he declined, she noticed that he lingered in nearby rooms when she played thereafter, close enough to hear, but maintaining that careful distance he seemed to require. The first snows of winter came early to Yorkshire that year, blanketing the moors in pristine white that sparkled beneath the December sun. Elizabeth had been at Thornfield Abbey for 2 months now, and the rhythm of her new life had settled into something almost comfortable, if one could be comfortable with a ghost. For that was what Marcus had become in his own home, a specter who haunted the edges of her days, present yet perpetually absent. It was the letters from her sisters that sustained her through those cold, quiet weeks. Jane wrote of her delight in her new circumstances, of the singing master Lord Blackmore's generosity had provided, of the small but respectable house in Bath where they now resided with Mrs. Fielding. Margaret sent lengthy missives discussing the books she was reading, the lectures she had been permitted to attend, the whole world of learning that had opened before her. And Rose, dear Rose, filled pages with cheerful chatter about new friends and pretty dresses and the assembly rooms where she would make her debut in 2 years' time. Their happiness was worth any price, Elizabeth reminded herself on the loneliest nights. And yet, as Christmas approached, she found herself yearning for something she could not quite name. Not love, certainly, for that was not part of their bargain, but perhaps understanding, or even simple companionship. The incident that changed everything occurred on a particularly bitter Tuesday afternoon. Elizabeth had ventured to the village, despite Mrs. Harrington's warnings about the threatening weather. The local vicar's wife had recently been delivered of a child, and Elizabeth felt it her duty as the new countess to pay her respects. She had spent longer than intended, charmed by the infant and drawn into conversation with several of the local women who had gathered to assist the new mother. By the time she departed, the sky had darkened ominously, and snow had begun to fall in earnest. Her coachman, old Patterson, expressed concern about the rapidly deteriorating conditions, but Elizabeth, perhaps foolishly, insisted they could make it home. They were less than halfway to the Abbey when the storm struck in full force, a blinding white fury that obscured the road entirely. Patterson did his best, but the carriage wheels found a hidden rut, and suddenly they were tilting, sliding, then overturning entirely into a snowbank. Elizabeth found herself thrown against the side of the coach, her head striking something hard enough to daze her. When she regained her senses, Patterson was calling to her through the wind, his voice thin with panic. His arm, he reported, was certainly broken, and the horses had bolted. Elizabeth managed to extricate herself from the overturned vehicle, though her head spun alarmingly and something warm trickled down her temple. The cold was immediate and vicious, cutting through her pelisse as if it were made of gossamer. Patterson, she quickly realized, was in no condition to seek help. She would have to go herself, though the Abbey was still at least 2 miles distant and the storm showed no sign of abating. She had perhaps struggled through half that distance, supporting Patterson as best she could, when she heard it, the thunder of hoofbeats through the storm. Then Marcus was there, materializing from the white void like some avenging angel, his greatcoat billowing behind him as he leaped from his mount. The relief in his eyes when he saw her was quickly replaced by something fiercer as he noted the blood on her face. Without ceremony, he lifted her onto his horse, then somehow managed to get Patterson secured as well. The journey back to the Abbey passed in a blur of wind and snow, and the solid warmth of Marcus's chest against her back, his arms encircling her to hold the reins. She felt, rather than heard him speaking to her, his voice a constant rumble of reassurance through the storm. Once at the Abbey, chaos erupted. Mrs. Harrington took charge of Patterson, sending for the doctor from the village, while Marcus carried Elizabeth directly to his study. The warmest room in the house, he said, though she suspected it was more that he could not bear to let her out of his sight. He tended to her head, wound himself with surprising gentleness, his fingers infinitely careful as they cleaned away the blood and assessed the damage. It was only after the doctor had come and gone, pronouncing both Elizabeth and Patterson fortunate to have escaped with minor injuries, that Marcus finally allowed his carefully maintained control to crack. Elizabeth, settled on the sofa before the fire with a glass of brandy he had insisted she drink, watched as he paced the room like a caged wolf, tension radiating from every line of his body. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with suppressed emotion. He had noticed her absence, had felt, somehow known, that something was amiss. The words that followed came in a rush, as if a dam had broken. He spoke of the terror that had gripped him when he found the overturned carriage, of the relief that had nearly brought him to his knees when he saw her walking through the storm. His hands trembled as he poured himself a brandy, and Elizabeth saw in that moment how close to the edge he had been driven by the thought of losing her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Elizabeth waited, sensing there was more, but not wishing to push. It would be days later, when the shock had faded and trust had deepened, that he would finally speak of James. But that night, all that mattered was that they were both safe, both present, both beginning to understand that their arrangement had become something neither had anticipated. Christmas came to Thornfield Abbey with a tentative joy that had been absent from its halls for half a decade. Elizabeth had convinced Marcus to allow her sisters to visit for the season, and their arrival had transformed the somber estate into something altogether lighter. Rose's laughter echoed through corridors that had known only silence, while Margaret's sharp observations and Jane's gentle warmth seemed to thaw something in their reluctant host. Marcus, to Elizabeth's surprise and secret delight, had thrown himself into making their guests welcome. He arranged riding expeditions for Rose, procured rare books for Margaret from his extensive library, and even accompanied Jane on the pianoforte one evening, revealing a musical talent he had kept hidden. Elizabeth watched these interactions with a growing warmth in her chest, seeing glimpses of the man he must have been before tragedy had reshaped him. The connection forged between them on that snowy night had not dissipated, but had instead grown stronger, manifesting in small, precious moments. A shared glance across the dinner table when Rose said something particularly precocious, his hand brushing hers as they passed in the hallway, lingering just a moment longer than propriety demanded. The way he had taken to joining her in the music room in the evenings, no longer hiding but sitting openly to listen as she played. It was 2 days before Christmas when the past returned to shatter their fragile peace. The arrival of Lady Catherine Worthington was as unexpected as it was unwelcome. She swept into Thornfield Abbey unannounced, her mourning clothes a stark reminder of all that had transpired. Elizabeth, returning from a walk with her sisters, found their guest already ensconced in the drawing room, Marcus standing before the fireplace with an expression of stone. Lady Catherine was everything Elizabeth was not, dark where she was fair, voluptuous where she was delicate, and possessed of the kind of dramatic beauty that commanded attention. She had been James's sister and Marcus's former fiancée. The woman he was to have married before that fatal day had destroyed everything. The conversation that followed was conducted with icy civility, at least while Elizabeth and her sisters were present. Lady Catherine spoke of business matters regarding the Worthington estate that required Marcus's attention, of legal documents that needed his signature. But beneath the veneer of propriety, Elizabeth sensed something else, a history, an intimacy that made her chest tight with an emotion she did not care to examine too closely. After dinner, when her sisters had retired, Elizabeth found herself passing the study where Marcus and Lady Catherine continued their discussion. The door stood slightly ajar, and though she knew she should not listen, something in Lady Catherine's tone made her pause. The words she heard froze her blood. Lady Catherine was speaking of forgiveness, of understanding, of second chances. She spoke of how she had come to realize that Marcus had not been at fault for James's death, that she had been wrong to break their engagement, that perhaps they might find their way back to what they had once shared. And then, devastating in its simplicity, she said she still loved him, had always loved him, and knew he felt the same. Elizabeth waited, her heart hammering, for Marcus to deny it, to speak of his marriage, of the changes in their circumstances. Instead, she heard only silence, a silence that seemed to stretch into eternity, before Marcus's low voice responded with words she could not make out, but in a tone that sounded unmistakably gentle, even tender. She fled then, not with mind reeling, but with the cold, terrible clarity of a ledger finely balanced. Every moment of hope, every shared glance, now revealed as miscalculations in her column of debits. The transaction was complete, and she had received exactly what she had bargained for: security, not love. Her carefully constructed world had not crumbled. It had simply revealed itself for what it had always been: a business arrangement, nothing more. She had been his chosen bride, the woman he had wanted to marry for love rather than obligation. Elizabeth was merely a business arrangement, a means to an end, a convenience that had provided him with the wife society demanded and the heir he would eventually require. How foolish she had been to imagine those moments of connection meant anything more than gratitude or perhaps mild affection. The next morning, Elizabeth's manner was perfectly correct, but notably cooler. If Marcus noticed the change, he gave no indication, seeming distracted and distant himself. Lady Catherine lingered, claiming the weather made travel inadvisable, and Elizabeth was forced to play hostess to the woman who had prior claim to her husband's heart. The situation reached its crescendo on Christmas Eve. Elizabeth, seeking solitude in the conservatory, came upon Marcus and Lady Catherine in what appeared to be an intimate embrace. In reality, Lady Catherine had thrown herself at Marcus in a moment of desperate grief, weeping for her lost brother, and Marcus had merely been offering comfort. But Elizabeth, seeing only their closeness, hearing only Lady Catherine's muffled words of love, turned and fled before she could witness Marcus gently but firmly setting Lady Catherine aside. That evening, Elizabeth played the perfect hostess, her smile never wavering even as her heart seemed to be tearing itself apart. She retired early, pleading a headache, and spent the night staring at the ceiling, wondering how she had been foolish enough to fall in love with a man who belonged to another. For that was the terrible truth she could no longer deny. Somewhere between that first meeting in her family's drawing room and this moment of devastating clarity, she had done the one thing she had sworn never to do. She had fallen irrevocably, completely, hopelessly in love with her husband. Christmas Day dawned gray and bitter, matching Elizabeth's mood perfectly. She descended to breakfast with her mask firmly in place, determined that neither her sisters nor the household should see her distress. Lady Catherine, she was informed, had departed at first light, claiming urgent business in London. Marcus was nowhere to be seen, having ridden out early despite the freezing weather. Elizabeth threw herself into the Christmas festivities with determined cheer, presiding over the exchange of gifts and the elaborate dinner with a grace that would have made any society hostess proud. But Jane, always the most perceptive of her sisters, noticed the strain around her eyes, the way her smile never quite reached them. When she attempted to inquire, Elizabeth deflected with practiced ease, speaking of the responsibilities of managing such a large household, of the natural fatigue that came with the season. It was late afternoon when Marcus finally returned, windburned and obviously exhausted from whatever demons he had been attempting to outride. He appeared for dinner, but contributed little to the conversation, his attention seemingly fixed on some internal struggle. The very air between them crackled with unspoken words, unacknowledged pain. That evening, as snow began to fall once more, Elizabeth found herself alone in the library. Her sisters had retired early, worn out from the day's excitement, and she had sought refuge among the books, hoping to lose herself in someone else's story rather than confront her own. She was thus engaged when Marcus entered, stopping short upon seeing her there. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the expanse of Turkish carpet and centuries-old furniture. Then Marcus spoke, his voice rough as she had never heard it. He told her that Lady Catherine had come to him with an offer, an annulment, arranged through her family's connections in the church on grounds that the marriage had never been properly consummated. She had promised to repay Elizabeth's settlement, to ensure her sisters were provided for, to make everything as it had been before. All he had to do was agree, and they could both be free. He to marry the woman he had once chosen. She to find a husband who could offer her more than cold courtesy and a house full of shadows. Elizabeth felt the blood drain from her face. So it was to be done then. She was to be set aside, discarded like an unwanted purchase that had served its purpose. She rose, her spine straight, despite the way her world was crumbling, and told him with perfect composure that she would agree to whatever he wished. Her sisters were now safe, their futures secured. She had fulfilled her part of their bargain. But as she moved to leave, to flee before her composure shattered entirely, Marcus caught her arm. The touch burned through the fabric of her gown, and she could not suppress the small gasp that escaped her. What followed was an outpouring unlike anything she could have imagined. Marcus, his careful control finally, completely shattered, told her the truth, all of it. How Lady Catherine's arrival had been a shock, yes, but not for the reasons Elizabeth supposed. How her offers of reconciliation had only served to remind him of why he had never truly loved her, not in the way that mattered. She had been a suitable choice, a match that pleased their families, but there had been no fire between them, no meeting of minds and souls. He spoke of how Elizabeth had changed everything, how her quiet strength and fierce loyalty to her sisters had first earned his respect, then his admiration, and finally, something far more dangerous. How watching her bring life back to Thornfield Abbey had been like watching spring return after an endless winter. How the sound of her playing the pianoforte had become the best part of his day. How that night in the snow, when he thought he might have lost her, had shown him the truth he had been trying desperately to deny. He loved her. Completely, desperately, with a depth that terrified him because he had never intended to love again, had never thought himself capable of it after what had happened with James. He had kept his distance not from indifference, but from fear. Fear that she would recoil if she knew the truth of his feelings. Fear that he would destroy this fragile peace they had built. Fear that he was too damaged to deserve the light she had brought into his life. Elizabeth stood frozen, his hand still on her arm, her mind struggling to reconcile his words with everything she had believed. When she finally found her voice, it emerged as barely a whisper, asking about what she had overheard, what she had seen. The misunderstanding unraveled quickly then. The conversation she had partially heard had been Marcus telling Lady Catherine that he could never return her feelings, that his heart belonged entirely to his wife. The embrace in the conservatory had been a moment of grief for the brother Lady Catherine had lost, nothing more. And Marcus had been telling her that she needed to move forward, to find happiness elsewhere. As understanding dawned, Elizabeth felt something crack open inside her chest, not breaking but flowering, like ice melting to reveal the green shoots beneath. She told him then, with characteristic directness, that he was an absolute fool if he thought she had been maintaining distance from anything but respect for his wishes, that she had fallen in love with him despite every rational argument against it, despite their practical arrangement, despite her determination to guard her heart. The kiss that followed was nothing like the chaste pecks society would have deemed appropriate. It was desperate and tender and fierce all at once, 5 months of suppressed longing poured into a single moment of connection. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Marcus rested his forehead against hers, his hands cradling her face with infinite tenderness. But even in that moment of joy, Elizabeth saw the shadows that still lingered in his eyes. The guilt over James, she realized, had not miraculously disappeared simply because they had declared their love. It would take time, patience, and perhaps something more to truly free him from the chains of his past. Spring came early to Yorkshire that year, as if nature itself wished to celebrate the transformation that had occurred at Thornfield Abbey. The gardens, which Elizabeth had spent the winter months planning with the head gardener, burst into glorious bloom, a riot of roses and lavender, forget-me-nots and sweet peas that perfumed the air with promise. But the most significant change was in Marcus himself. The man who had once haunted his own home like a specter now filled it with his presence. He smiled, truly smiled, in a way that transformed his austere features into something approaching boyishness. He laughed at Rose's terrible jokes when she visited, engaged in spirited debates with Margaret about philosophy and literature, and accompanied Jane on the pianoforte with increasing frequency. But it was the way he looked at Elizabeth with such naked adoration that it sometimes made her blush, that truly marked the depth of his transformation. Yet shadows still lingered. Elizabeth would sometimes catch him staring at nothing, his mind clearly years and miles away. On the anniversary of James's death in March, he had locked himself in his study for the entire day, emerging hollow-eyed and silent. She had held him that night as he wept, years of suppressed grief finally finding release. But she knew that true healing required more than tears. The solution came from an unexpected source. In April, a letter arrived bearing the Worthington seal, but the handwriting was unfamiliar. It was from James's younger brother, Thomas, now grown and recently returned from his grand tour. He requested an audience with Marcus on a matter of urgent importance. Marcus had gone white upon reading the letter, and for a moment, Elizabeth feared he would refuse. But she placed her hand over his, reminding him gently that running from the past had never served him well. With great reluctance, he agreed to receive Thomas Worthington. The young man who arrived the following week bore a striking resemblance to his late brother, enough to make Marcus flinch upon first seeing him. But where James had been fair, Thomas was dark, and his manner was more serious, more considered. He came bearing a packet of letters, James's private correspondence, which Thomas had only recently discovered while going through family papers in preparation for his coming of age. Among them was a letter James had written the night before his death, apparently meant to be sent to Marcus but never posted. In it, James had written of his concerns about the journey, of a premonition that had troubled him, and most importantly, of his gratitude for Marcus's friendship. He spoke of how he knew Marcus would blame himself if anything went wrong, knowing his friend's tendency to carry the world's weight on his shoulders. He explicitly absolved Marcus of any responsibility, joking that if he, James, was foolish enough to get himself killed playing hero, Marcus was to remember him fondly, but not to waste his life on guilt. But perhaps even more powerful than James's words was what Thomas said next. He spoke of how their sister Catherine had poisoned the family's view of events, how her grief had needed someone to blame. But Thomas had always doubted the story, had spent years investigating what had truly happened that day. He had found the governess, now a respectable married woman in Birmingham, who confirmed Marcus's account in every detail. More than that, she spoke of how Marcus's actions had saved her life and honor, how his willingness to bear society's condemnation had protected her reputation when she had been at her most vulnerable. Thomas had come not seeking reconciliation, but to offer it, and more, to offer public vindication. He intended to make the truth known, to restore Marcus's reputation, to ensure that society understood what had really transpired on that snowy road 5 years ago. Marcus's response to this offer surprised everyone, including Elizabeth. He declined, gently but firmly. He had no need for society's approval, he said. The people who mattered knew the truth. His tenants, his servants, his family. Here his eyes found Elizabeth. They knew who he was. That was enough. And perhaps more importantly, he added with a calm that he had not possessed years before, there had been enough suffering attached to the Worthington name. There was no need to drag Catherine's reputation through the mud to clear his own. James would not have wanted his family torn apart for the sake of vindication. But Thomas Worthington was as stubborn as his brother had been impulsive. Over the following weeks, the truth began to circulate nonetheless, quietly at first, then with gathering momentum. The governess, now Mrs. Chapman, wrote her own account to several influential ladies. Thomas spoke at his club, defending Marcus's honor with passionate eloquence. Even Lady Catherine, perhaps feeling guilty for her years of unjust hatred, added her voice to the chorus of vindication. By the time the season began in earnest, the rehabilitation of the Earl of Blackmore's reputation was complete. Invitations poured in from every fashionable house in London, requests for his presence at everything from intimate dinners to grand balls. Marcus viewed these with wry amusement, having no intention of accepting any of them. It was Elizabeth who convinced him to make one exception: a ball at Ashworth House, the London residence of the Duke of Ashworth, Marcus's distant cousin, and one of the few who had never entirely cut him, despite the scandal. It would be, she argued, a chance to show the world that he had survived their censure, that he had found happiness despite their attempts to destroy him. More importantly, though she did not say this aloud, it would be a chance for her to dance with her husband, something they had never done. The night of the Ashworth ball, Elizabeth stood before her mirror, hardly recognizing the woman reflected there. Her gown was of midnight blue silk, cut in the latest fashion, but with a timeless elegance that suited her perfectly. The Blackmore diamonds, a wedding gift from Marcus she had never before worn, sparkled at her throat and in her hair. But it was the happiness radiating from her face that truly transformed her. Marcus appeared in the doorway of her dressing room, resplendent in evening clothes that emphasized his dark, good looks. For a moment, they simply gazed at each other, and Elizabeth saw in his eyes the same wonder she felt, that they had found each other against all odds, across a chasm of pain and duty and misunderstanding. The ball itself was a triumph. Their entrance caused the predictable sensation: the reformed pariah and his unexpected bride, more in love than any arranged marriage had a right to be. They danced the first dance together, a waltz that had recently become acceptable, and Elizabeth felt as if she were floating. Marcus held her as if she were made of spun glass and starlight, his eyes never leaving her face. As they turned about the floor, Elizabeth caught glimpses of familiar faces: her sisters, radiant in their new gowns, Margaret deep in conversation with a young scholar, Jane surrounded by admirers, and Rose carefully chaperoned but glowing with excitement. Lord Pemberton stood beaming beside his wife, clearly taking credit for the match. Even Lady Catherine was there, on the arm of a distinguished diplomat, having finally moved forward with her own life. But it was the expression on Marcus's face that Elizabeth knew she would remember forever: the wonder, the gratitude, the love that transformed his features into something magnificent. As the music swelled around them, he leaned close enough to whisper, his breath warm against her ear, telling her that she had saved him in every way a person could be saved. Elizabeth's response was characteristic in its directness, yet infused with the pragmatic wisdom of one who had spent months balancing debits and credits to save her family. She smiled and informed him, with the same practicality with which she might close a ledger, that the accounts between them were, at last, perfectly balanced. There were no debts remaining between them, only shared profit, the kind that could not be measured in pounds and shillings, but in the currency of the heart. She had given him herself, not the convenient wife he had purchased, but Elizabeth, the woman who had learned that some transactions yielded returns beyond any calculation. As their dance ended and another began, Elizabeth realized that this moment of perfect happiness, was not the end of their story, but merely the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, certainly. Marcus still carried scars that would never fully heal, and she had her own fears and insecurities to overcome. But they would face them together. These two souls who had found each other across a divide of duty and pain. The gossips would talk naturally. They would speak of the Fairmont girl who had sold herself for her sister's security and somehow managed to capture the heart of the most elusive earl in England. They would whisper of the transformation of Thornfield Abbey from a house of shadows to one filled with light and laughter. They would speculate about the obvious affection between the earl and his countess, so different from the cold arrangement everyone had expected. Let them talk, Elizabeth thought, as Marcus led her into another dance, his hand warm and steady in hers. The ton could make of their story what they wished. The truth, that love could grow from the most unpromising ground, that two damaged souls could heal each other, that happiness could be found even after accepting what seemed like defeat, that truth belonged to them alone. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth found herself standing on the terrace for a moment of cool air, Marcus beside her, his hand resting possessively at the small of her back. Below them, the lights of London glimmered, a patchwork of oil lamps and the bold new gas flames in some of the grander quarters, creating a constellation of human ambition against the darkness. Behind them, the ball continued, music and laughter spilling out into the night. She thought of that morning months ago when she had sat studying ledgers, preparing to sacrifice herself for her sister's future. How could she have known that in accepting that sacrifice, she would find not imprisonment, but freedom, not duty, but love, not a business transaction, but a true partnership of hearts and minds? Marcus seemed to sense her thoughts, drawing her closer against his side. Tomorrow, they would return to Yorkshire, to their real life away from London's glittering facade. There would be a state business to manage, tenants to visit, plans to make for the future that stretched before them, bright with promise. There would, God willing, be children eventually, heirs to carry on the Ashworth name, but more importantly, souls to nurture and love. But tonight, in this perfect moment suspended between past and future, Elizabeth allowed herself to simply be, to exist in the warm circle of her husband's arms, to feel the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm, to know that she was exactly where she belonged. The autumn sun cast golden light across the gardens of Thornfield Abbey as Elizabeth sat in her favorite spot beneath the ancient oak, a letter from Jane in her lap. Her sister wrote from Italy, where she and her new husband, that same young scholar from the Ashworth Ball, were enjoying an extended honeymoon. Margaret had taken up residence in London, where she had scandalized and delighted society in equal measure by opening a school for young ladies that emphasized intellectual rigor over mere accomplishments. And Rose, dear Rose, was in her second season, breaking hearts with cheerful abandon while she waited for a love like her eldest sister had found. The sound of laughter drew Elizabeth's attention to the lawn where Marcus was attempting to teach their son, a sturdy boy of 3 with his father's dark hair and his mother's gray eyes, the finer points of bowling a hoop. Little James, named for the friend whose memory was now a blessing rather than a curse, attacked the task with enthusiasm if not skill, his delighted shrieks echoing across the grounds. In her arms, Elizabeth cradled their daughter, barely 6 months old, who gazed up at her with solemn blue eyes that promised to darken to her father's gray in time. Lady Sarah Ashworth had arrived with the spring flowers, completing their family in ways Elizabeth had never dared dream. Marcus looked up, catching her eye across the garden, and smiled, that private, tender smile that was hers alone. The years had been kind to him. The lines of pain that had once marked his face softened into something gentler. He still had his dark moments, times when the past reached out with ghostly fingers, but they were rare now, brief shadows that passed quickly in the light of their shared happiness. Mrs. Harrington approached with the tea tray, setting it down with the comfortable familiarity of long service. The housekeeper, now more friend than servant, paused to coo over baby Sarah before returning to the house where preparations for the harvest festival were underway. It had become a tradition at Thornfield Abbey, this celebration that brought together all the county, from the grandest lord to the humblest tenant farmer. As Elizabeth poured her tea, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. The girl who had once sat in a shabby drawing room in London, prepared to barter herself for her sister's future, could never have imagined this life, not just the comfort and security, though those were not to be discounted, but the love that permeated every corner of their existence. Marcus approached, young James riding triumphantly on his shoulders, and settled beside her on the blanket she had spread beneath the tree. Their son immediately abandoned his father to investigate the basket of biscuits Mrs. Harrington had included, while Marcus drew Elizabeth against his side, careful of the baby in her arms. They sat in companionable silence, watching the sun sink lower over the moors, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. In the distance, the village church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to evensong. It was a sound that had once seemed mournful to Elizabeth, but now spoke only of continuity, of life flowing on in its eternal rhythm. Young James, his face liberally decorated with biscuit crumbs, climbed into his father's lap, demanding a story. Marcus obliged, spinning a tale of brave knights and clever princesses that bore suspicious resemblance to their own history, though dressed in the garb of fantasy. Elizabeth listened with half an ear, her attention divided between her husband's voice and her daughter's gentle breathing. As the story concluded with the inevitable happily ever after, James asked the question children always ask. Was it real? Did the knight and princess really live happily ever after? Marcus's eyes found Elizabeth's, holding a wealth of shared memories, pain transmuted into joy, duty transformed into love, two separate lives woven into one strong enough to weather any storm. Yes, he told their son, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. Sometimes, if two people were very fortunate and very brave, they really did live happily ever after. And so, another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society. The Fairmont girl who sold herself to save her sisters had discovered that sometimes the greatest sacrifices lead to the greatest rewards. The Earl who had locked himself away in guilt and grief had learned that redemption came not through punishment, but through allowing himself to be loved. Together, they had created something that all the gossips of the ton could never have predicted. A marriage based not on convenience or arrangement, but on the deepest understanding, respect, and love. They had taken what society had intended as a business transaction and transformed it into a romance worthy of the poets. As darkness fell over Thornfield Abbey, the windows glowing warm with lamplight, the family made their way inside. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, as all tomorrows do. But tonight, in this moment, all was well in their world. A world built on sacrifice and sustained by love, where broken hearts had learned to beat again, and where happiness, that most elusive of treasures, had finally found a permanent home. The tale of Lady Elizabeth and Lord Marcus, Earl of Blackmore, had reached not an ending, but a beginning. The beginning of all the years that stretched ahead, filled with the ordinary miracles of family life, the quiet contentment of mutual understanding, and the enduring power of a love that had conquered every obstacle in its path. In the annals of society, their story would be remembered as one of the great love matches of the age. But in the quiet of their own hearts, they knew it as something simpler and more profound, proof that sometimes, just sometimes, two souls meant for each other will find their way home, no matter how dark the path or how impossible the journey might seem. And is that not, dear reader, the greatest romance of all?